I rise on this occasion to wrap up what has been an enlightening debate on the Credit Reporting Bill 2018. And I want to thank those members of the Parliament who made their contribution and lent to a greater clarity and elucidation as to the relevance and importance of the Credit Reporting Bill and how germane it is to our lives. And so I must record deep appreciation to the member for Nevis number 9, and before him, the member for Nevis 10, and then also to the Honorable Long-Learned Attorney General for their important contribution to the discussion of this bill. The bill, of course, is part and parcel of our obligations as member states of a common currency union, and where this has been determined by the Monetary Council to be critical to the ongoing development of the financial services sector, where this has been determined to be important if we are to help propel growth further within the sub-region. And so we are happy to be playing our role as partners for the progressive development of the sub-region. But if there was not that obligation that comes from the shared union, there would of necessity still required that the state intervene, as we are attempting to do now, to bring legislation and a bill akin to the one which has gone through the debate in the National Assembly. Because this is providing the kind of institutional framework and regulatory framework that allows for greater efficiencies in the credit market and for more efficacious outcomes to be experienced and enjoyed by the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. In my opening presentation, I attempted to show that the bill had significance not only for us in our individual and private capacity, but critically important because all of us at the end of the day are economic actors, and the collective decisions determine where the country will go. This bill calls then for a more objective and fairer approach to credit decision making and empowers certain entities with the task of regulating the financial space for credit. In this regard, it is the central bank, and empowers other entities, for now credit bureaus, to be able to make money or to engage in the business of the provision of suited information that will assist lenders. We heard in the contributions that come a call for greater personal responsibility, a call for persons to manage their lives, and this is always an important call. It may not always be a popular call, but it's a call that must be repeated if we are to help people to be responsible citizens. People have to do their own self-examination. What it is I want out of life, and what is required of me to be able to get to where I want to get within the context of law. And one critical attribute, if you will, that comes over and over as we face the challenges of life and as we deal with the challenges of nation building is a question of discipline and industry. Discipline and industry. In the good old days, it was inculcated in us that we must work for that which we want. It is still very powerful advice for each of us as economic actors. We have to prepare to accept the virtue of an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. And we use that honest day's pay to be able to acquire those material things which we think are important for our progress and onward journey. Discipline becomes critical, and financial discipline is even more critical if we are to live lives that are manageable and that allows us, as it were, to avoid the embarrassment that comes from overextending ourselves and the consequences of having the bailiff interfere with our normal routines. As persons perhaps have had difficulty with the challenges of meeting their financial needs, and in part in managing and budgeting and planning for them and sequencing them, because it is not everything that we would wish for in the world we can have. Not everything that we can have at the same time. We may be able to take the vacation next year, and we may be able to acquire the furniture this year. But in attempting to get all of them at the same time, we can overextend ourselves with calamitous consequences for ourselves and our family. So the question of the discipline in our ways becomes critically important, and we would want to encourage more of this. We have seen the fallouts, the high non-performing loans, both at the individual consumer level and at the level of the corporate sector, which speaks to some business model going awry, which speaks to the fact that persons have not been able to meet their commitments. And it is not only a question of meeting the commitments, but you must meet them as they fall due. You must meet them on time. And so we have to think through what it is we want, how we are going to get them, where there is this mismatch between revenues and our expenditure, how we are going to get them back in equilibrium. You're working for X dollars, your expenditure can't be X plus one. Save, you have grants, donations, contributions, or lending. And usually, whenever there are difficulty, the first thing that persons say is that the pit is small. Perhaps we have to look now at our expenditure side, because over that we have significant control. The pay is determined by the employer, and the employer will not change the rate just to suit you, especially if he or she has a large group of employees to contend with. What you can change is really your expenditure habits. What you can change is how often you go to the movie. What you can change is how often you will have a party for every child whose birthday comes. What you can change is what you will buy at Christmas. What you can change is whether you will get a lift over the strip or you will get your own rental to take you there. For each of these decisions comes with financial implications. that could either put you in a better position to manage or in a worse position. Decision has consequences, and we therefore have to think through some of these. And it is not that anyone would wish to tell people how to live their lives, except somebody must do that. And indeed, the church, in fact, attempts always to tell us what we must do. So it is that we need help and guidance, and we can live from the experience of others, and we should therefore be open to counsel, knowing that in the end, the decision would be ours. So we urge again everyone in the public sector, in the private sector, to be more disciplined and more responsible. We have seen the growth of entities, call them quote unquote fast cash entities, that have come onto the financial landscape largely because many persons found it difficult to access credit through the traditional formal systems of our banks. The banks, of course, have a tendency to put an over-reliance on collateral. For everything, there's a need for collateral, and that has provided a disincentive. The fast cash comes and promises that you can get it today if you will pay when payday comes. And the attractive nature on first sight begs of us to give consideration whether at times it is too good to be true. Because the interest rates charged by the fast cash entities are some of the highest interest rate levied on credit anywhere in the world. So it may look tempting that you can borrow the $500, but if you're going to pay 30% interest and 40% interest as obtains in our marketplace, you will be putting yourself in a very difficult position to meet those payments as they fall through. And the government will do an engagement with these fast cash providers of services, because we believe that the interest rate charge and the requirements are somewhat punitive for the ordinary people. In the same way as the member and foreign minister spoke to the need for the business entities, the supplier of credits, the courts, the TDCs, the SL Horse Virgin Bank, and the credit union, they too have to share in the responsibility for loans and credit support which have gone bad. They have to share in some of that responsibility. They at times tempt persons in with a dollar doubt, pay later, and without giving proper education, awareness, notice of some of the consequences attending to these arrangements. There is an element of unfairness in that courts, only by way of illustration, and are not attributing a negative, or any other provider of hire purchase, can lure a customer in with these almost fanciful offers that you can pay $1 down and you can get an asset 1,000 times that value, and not understand that you are creating a sense of artificiality in the marketplace with consequences for non-payment. And when that non-payment comes, would it be right that you get this judgment debtor summons, that you take the debtor to the court for a judgment, oftentimes the debtor would not go to court because the workout can't pay and not going up there to say what? I have the goods. You are able to recover the goods. The debt is not extinguished and the person goes to jail. My government is of the view that that system has to be reviewed. And at our last meeting of the cabinet, we invited the Attorney General to get his legal department to look at the matter of debtors' jail with a view to bringing an end to it or some of the most punitive aspect of it. Because, as the Foreign Affairs Minister said, in the application of that outdated concept of debtors' jail, we end up criminalizing poverty. We end up criminalizing persons when they had been lured, unthinkingly perhaps, into certain financial arrangements. I'm advised that the debtors' prison in England is a concept that goes back to the 13th century when statutes were enacted that imprisoned individuals for unpaid debts. And the rationale behind that practice was that the threat of incarceration would terrify the debtor into paying the bad debt. This practice found its way in most parts of the early modern world, the power then of the empire, and in the 17th century, it traveled with the English common law to other continents and eventually through the Caribbean through the consequences of colonialization, etc. The concept behind the debtor's prison have been proven to be antiquated and flawed. If a person is thrown into prison, as many are here, that person cannot earn to repay the debts which continues to accumulate. And somebody hides behind the technicality. Well, you're gone to the jail because you didn't obey the court order. But what gave origin and genesis to the court order? A failure to pay the debt. And we are saying, to have people going to jail in those circumstances, some of those clearly articulated by the member for Nevis 9, would not be what we would want to be part of a modern St. Kitts and Nevis. Over time, the treatment of debtors has evolved to be more equitable, whereby an individual can only be imprisoned in certain circumstances, such as contempt of court or certain debt or fraudulent offenses that are incorporated in the criminal codes. In Trinidad and Tobago, in Barbados and Bahamas, I'm advised that they have gone a long way to nullify the concept of debtor's jail as it had been operated since colonial times. I am advised that the government have implemented what is now described as Debtors' Acts that prevent an individual from being incarcerated for failing to pay a debt. And that is what we want to bring here. That no longer, once we have done the consultations with the business community, no longer would an individual be incarcerated for failing to pay a debt, save in very specific circumstances. And when we look at the legislation in Trinidad, in Bahamas, and Trinidad and Tobago, to each its own, they have carved out certain circumstances or conditions which they have said in these particular circumstances the individual can be incarcerated. And we will look at those as part of the debate going forward. So, for example, child support or child maintenance, better phraseology, has been held sacred in some of these jurisdictions. And so in those contexts, the legislation provides for persons to go to jail. When there are certain breaches of judiciary responsibilities, the legislation does provide for persons to go to jail. So we will look at all those models, and the Attorney General will shortly bring a paper to the Cabinet, getting our guidance and consensus at how we would move forward. For today, we say that as we are thinking forward to a better St. Kitts and Nevis, as we are contemplating the journey of nationhood some 35 years since independence, the ancient, antiquated, flawed notion of a debtor's jail, of the incarcerating of our people for failing to pay debt, especially when they have been lured into these debt, is something that will not be part of our books for much longer. And we will work with the relevant stakeholders to find a best model and the best alternative to what now some have described as the criminalization of poverty, given what the member for Nevis 9 described as the tendency in some entities to engage in predatory lending practices. And so we want to shift some of the balance. My attention was drawn to a case of the application of the debtor's jail in recent vintage. And in this regard, it was in 2011, I'm advised, that our good friend Rock was incarcerated for failing to pay a debt to the National Bank. In an article written by Teresa McCall of SKN Vibes, dated the 5th December, Rock had this to say, and we are now in full agreement with Rock. He said, "I am one who believes that nobody should go jail for debt. There should be some kind of arrangement made for people to pay. Because, for instance, when you put somebody in jail for a month or a week, that is doing the person more harm. More harm indeed than good. During that month or week, the person may end up lose then a job, which they now have. So we have to revisit that. And the Rock case illustrates the need for the government of St. Kitts and Nevis to consider, as we did at our last cabinet, enacting legislation that properly sets out under what specific circumstances the government will allow a debtor to be lawfully imprisoned. These circumstances may include breach of various fraudulent offenses, breach of judiciary duties, theft, and family law and support child maintenance breaches. These, however, are matters which the Attorney General is yet to bring before the Cabinet. And so the Cabinet position, save for the guiding principle that we will end, as it were, the incarceration of persons for debt, the full remit of that we will engage the relevant stakeholders on. I want to thank the member for Nevis 9 for raising that matter as part of his contribution to the debate on this very, very critical matter. In attempting to fill one institutional and legislative gap, we find that there's a need now for reform of our laws as they relate to the issue of debtor's jail. And that a modern St. Kitts and Nevis, an independent St. Kitts and Nevis, must answer the question, how do we treat persons who have become as it were, unable to meet their commitments that they would have entered into? And how do we restore the balance, the asymmetric power relationship between those who are given the credit, usually in special terms, usually without educating those to whom they are offering these services of their consequences? How do we restore a balance between the lender and borrower? As it is right now, it is the borrower who is getting the worst end. And we will bring legislative reform this year, hopefully, to address this matter. Again, the member for number 9, always in his wisdom, lends much to these debates and give the advice as a father would to a child, as a mentor would to another person. And I hope that those who listen to his excellent presentation, honed in a history of engagement at the people, at the community level, himself being a banker of high note and vintage, and now serving the public for well over 30 plus years, that his presentation would not be lost. Vance's Nevis 10. That the contribution of the senior minister would not be lost. I hope that when we bring the legislation to quote unquote phase out this antiquated colonial piece of legislation which comes with debtor's drill, we will have no division, because there will be fulsome endorsement of that progressive piece of legislation in this honorable House. And we attempt to repatriate our own values as an independent nation. Again, Mr. Speaker, I close with thanks, because I thought the contributions were very rich, very edifying, very helpful, and they set the bar high in the context of the debate in the Parliament. I hope that the future debates will match. Those who have not commented, I draw no conclusion from their silence, save to say that we are all here today and no objection has been raised with respect to this matter.
Always ask for a division, you know.
I therefore, Mr. Speaker, commend the bill, the Credit Reporting Bill 2018, for second reading, and hope that we can get through the committee stages today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Stay up to date with news, programs, and activities of the government with SKNIS. Like us on Facebook. Listen to us on SoundCloud. Follow us on Twitter. And watch our videos on YouTube. Connect with us today. SKNIS, St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service.